Hi, this is Starkey Sowers. Welcome again to another Plus Program training series. Today's topic, milk and milk substitutes, and this is part one. You ever gotten into the grocery store and looked around at the milk categories or the milk section, so to speak? It seems like every time you turn around, there's some type of new milk product or some type of a new milk substitute product that ends up on the shelf. So today what we're going to do is kind of go through some basics and maybe just give you a little bit of understanding as you journey into that area and maybe not feel so intimidated, so to speak. So let's look at the history of milk and maybe understand milk a little bit so we just kind of maybe know where it came from. A lot of times I like to look at something and think, well, where did this come from? Ultimately, we've got to look at it, maybe just have a little bit of history knowledge based on that. So when we look at milk, what we notice is this. We look at Egyptian pamphlets, ultimately little depictions or signs or pictures of milk consumption dating back probably 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, as well as biblical and Hindu references to milk consumption. We know that milk has definitely been a staple in diets for centuries long. All right, so let's kind of maybe fast forward that a little bit. We look at 400 AD, and we started noticing that Europeans were actually using different types of animal milks. And so sheep, as well as cow, as well as goat. And finally, by roughly about 1300 BC or AD, we notice that milk is the actual staple, so to speak. When it comes to milks, we notice that it was cow milk that became the staple in the European areas. All right, so what about the United States? Well, we see 1611 as well as 1624, and we notice that the Pilgrims and a lot of the individuals started bringing cows to the Americas, so to speak, and it started the whole boom, so to speak, of what we call the milk industry. And there's a large history of that as well, too. But one thing that's very unique about this is when we look at the milk consumption, one of the greatest things that has happened is pasteurization. Roughly about 1800s, Louis Pasteur, with his discovery of pasteurization, kind of made milk a little bit more safer for consumption. All right, so with that said, let's look at milk and let's see what's in milk maybe that makes it such a great value. Why in the world do so many people go to milk as a go-to staple? Well, number one on the list has got to be protein. So when we look at protein, casein protein is the dominant protein that is in milk. Casein protein roughly has about 80% of the characteristics of all the proteins, and those casein proteins are a little bit slower to digest and kind of occupying the stomach for a period of time. It's kind of one of the reasons why you'll get satiety, so to speak, when it comes to milk. 20% are the whey proteins. Within that whey protein, we'll also find that there's immunoglobulin proteins that are great for the immune system. All right, so then lactose. When we look at lactose, what we know about lactose is about 15 to 20% of the people in the United States are lactose sensitive, so they don't digest milks, which of course makes the milk substitutes a great value, which we'll look at in section number 2. All right, so lactose does have some benefits though. One thing that it does do is it actually feeds good bacteria. So when it feeds good bacteria, the good bacteria that are naturally inherent into the gastrointestinal system actually proliferate what we call lactic acid and keeps the bad bacteria from overgrowing. So that's a great thing. So don't forget, lactose has a purpose. All right, then there's also fatty acids. And when we look at the fatty acids that are specifically in milk, a large percentage of those are saturated fats. But within those saturated fats, there is a good amount of what we call medium chain triglycerides or smaller fats or shorter fats, and also the short fatty acids. All right. So that kind of gives you a little bit of information about what's in there. The other thing that we got to do is kind of maybe look at the containers of milk. Oftentimes when we look at a container of milk, it says it's pasteurized and homogenized. Well, what does it mean to be pasteurized? We'll give a little introduction to Louis Pasteur, 1800s, and he actually invented the idea of pasteurization. And so what he did is he actually took milk and he put it in a temperature of roughly about 145 degrees for roughly about 30 minutes. And what it does is it kills all the microbes, the bacteria, the different types of pathogens that might be in there that might cause what we call milk-borne sicknesses. And so by doing this, it greatly reduced milk-borne sicknesses and improved the safety of milk dramatically. So then the other thing you might see is what is known as homogenization. Homogenization started in the late 1920s, and ultimately what they do is they kind of high pressure milk through a tube and they push it through like a filter with a very small amount of, small holes. And what this does is it fractionates the fats that are in milk and causes them to disperse into tiny little droplets. So what this ultimately does is it prevents the milk fats from rising to the top so you don't have to shake it each and every time that you consume it. It's a little bit more of a convenience thing more than anything else. And there are a lot of milks that are on the market that are pasteurized but not homogenized. So if you don't prefer to have your fats broken up, you can actually look for that as well too. All right, so let's look at some of the benefits of milk. So when we look at the benefits of milk, we'll go kind of down the line. first of all, high in proteins. One thing that's unique about the casein proteins, increases the absorption of different types of minerals. The other thing is it also has small peptides. And some of these small peptides are known as ACE inhibitors. So what they actually have been known to do is actually reduce hypertension. So in addition to that, we also see that CLA, which is a great fat, helps to regulate inflammation and reduce what we call like an immune response. The other thing CLA is good for is metabolism. So those are a couple key benefits that we actually see when it comes to milk products. All right, so you can't talk about milk without talking about yogurts and kefirs. Yogurts and kefirs, there's all sorts of history about it. We see that kefir actually has its roots, so to speak, to the Turks way back in the day when they'd carry milk around in their leather satchels, and ultimately it produces kefir. So kefir is kind of like a liquid yogurt. Yogurt's typically got a little bit of thickening agents added to it, so it thickens up a little bit. The big thing to note about kefirs and yogurts is this. Number one, they have good bacteria, acidophilus, Lactobacillus acidophilus, as well as Lactobacillus bifidus, as well as bifidobacterium. And what they do is they kind of inoculate into the intestinal tract, and they produce good producing bacteria that ultimately helps with the immune system. So the other thing that we know about these particular products when consumed on a regular basis, they actually reduce the overall cholesterol that is in the body. So a couple thoughts on them. Good for immune system, helps to reduce cholesterol, also kind of helps to reduce inflammation, and just good feeling and good digestion all the way around, making them what we would categorize milks as the anti-aging food, all right? And that became popularized, especially during the Bulgarian times with Dr. Mishnikov. All right, so now we got to look at some of the controversies about milk. There are some controversies out there. Number one on the list is RBST, which is known as recombinant benign growth hormone. And so the growth hormone industry really kind of boomed back in 1990 when they legalized it. And they added it to not only cows' feed, but also possibly injected it into the cows themselves. Why would they do this? First of all, Monsanto was the company that developed it. Number one, it was a great attribute to increase the production of milk, roughly about 10 to 20%. Okay? There's a bunch of wars that went on. A lot of people said, hey, you know what? We're not going to put RBST milk into our milk, or we're not going to harvest RBST milk. And so what we're going to do is make sure that our milk doesn't have it. So they started putting it on the labels. Monsanto actually took them to court and said, hey, you can't do this because ultimately you're trying to say that this is a better milk. Well, when the United States Department of Agriculture looked at it and said, well, statistically it's the same milk. So no, we're not going to let them do that. So Monsanto won the court case, but they did allow them to say without RBST on the front, and then with a statement that basically says, not necessarily guaranteed that this is a better milk for you. A lot of us don't want RBST, so typically we will look for that. So that's one of the controversies surrounding milk, trying to bring you up to speed. So one of the things also that we do when we look at milk is raw milk. Oftentimes people get a little concerned about raw milk. We've had it on the shelves for years. A couple different things to remember about raw milk, usually pasture-fed situations, which means that the amounts of good fats, the CLAs and omega-3s are going to be much higher. The other thing is their bacteria count typically has to be much lower, and it also has to be refrigerated. There is typically a warning for children as well as for older adults and individuals that have a compromised immune system, not supposed to be consuming it unless you ask your doctor about it. All right, so finally, pasture or grass-fed types of milk products become very substantial in the last probably 10 years. So a couple things we know, when we actually feed the cows like a grass-fed area and they're allowed to graze in the pastures, they ultimately have a couple things that are very significant to the milk that they produce. Number one, much higher in CLA. Remember, CLA was that anti-obesity fatty acid that's found in milk. The other thing is much higher in omega-3 fatty acids, and those omega-3 fatty acids are the ones that are typically so lacking in the American diet. So if you're an individual that wants a good amount of omega-3s and also a CLA, you definitely want to use the pasture grazed milk being the staple. All right, some final notes. When we think of organic, of course, has no RBST. The other thing about organic is guaranteed very much lower in any type of pesticides or antibiotics or things of that nature, and not allowed to be used in the manufacturing, so to speak, of milk. So this kind of wraps up the milk story. So stay in tune to part 2 because we're going to go through the milk substitutes.